Let's move now into the thigh muscles. The thigh has three compartments. And if we think about it as three compartments, as I'm drawing here, here's the bone in the center. And we're going to say that this is lateral and this is medial. And what we see is that we have this great big anterior compartment. We have a very large posterior compartment, and we have a medial compartment. Okay, the anterior thigh are flexors of the hip and extensors of the knee. We think about the quadriceps muscles in this group and a couple other pair. It's all about the femoral nerve. If you've watched the video on the splits of the lumbar and sacral plexus. So anterior thigh, think quadriceps. Posterior thigh, on the other hand, notice that they are opposite movements, extensors of the hip, flexors of the knee. This is why you just can't say it's flexors or it's extensors. You have to say which joint is being moved and which direction. You have to be specific. It's all about the tibial nerve. And this group, the posterior thigh, is all about the hamstring muscles. The medial thigh, on the other hand, is about the obturator nerve because it's all about the adductors. And they get names like adductor brevis and adductor magnus. So we have the adductors in the medial thigh, the hamstrings in the posterior thigh, and the quadriceps in the anterior thigh. We'll start with the anterior hip and thigh. There's actually 6 muscles here. Quadriceps is the biggest group, but we have 2 other muscles. One of them is known as iliopsoas, which is actually a fusion of iliacus and psoas major. And we have a muscle named sartorius, as well as the quadriceps. And then we have 4 muscles in the quadriceps, which are actually different. All 6 of these muscles are innervated by the femoral nerve. Let's start here with iliopsoas. The way to say this muscle is it's il, e, o, so, as. And the key is the P is silent, like in psychology or psychiatry. So we've got this silent P. Ilio is 3 syllables, actually. It comes from iliacus, which is from the iliac fossa. I remember when we looked at the os coccyx, I pointed out that we have this big fossa, and just like on the scapula, the muscle is named for the fossa. And we have psoas major, which comes from the vertebral bodies of T12 through L5. There is a psoas minor, but about 50% of us don't have it. Therefore, we don't even look at it. They fuse together into this huge muscle that then comes and it inserts on the lesser trochanter. It only crosses the hip. It can only move the hip. And the movement is hip flexion. Like when you want to take a step, you lift your thigh, you flex your hip, and that's how you take a step. If you activate both of them when you're standing, you take a bow. And the innervation is the femoral nerve, which you can see here in the yellow. Now, what we see here crossing the brim of the pelvis, we see the vein, the artery, and the nerve. And when you're looking in the body, you can tell them apart. And the mnemonic is VAN, V-A-N, which stands for vein, artery, nerve. And what we see here is that the vein is usually dark and very flat. The artery will actually be kind of a white color because of the connective tissue, and it will look round. And the nerve will be kind of a white yellowish color because of the connective tissue. The way to tell them apart is the artery, if you push on it with your finger, in gloves, of course, it will be hollow. It will collapse like a tube, and the nerve is solid. But when you're just looking at them, the way to tell them apart is it always goes vein, artery, nerve, medial to lateral. The other unique muscle of the thigh is sartorius. It's my favorite muscle. I've done a couple different demonstrations with you guys on this. It comes from the anterior superior iliac spine. I still love saying that word. And so it's coming from the high point on the os coxa. It wraps all the way down to the tibia, and it's not on the tibial tuberosity. It is on the medial anterior tibia. And this medial anterior tibia is not on the tibial tuberosity. The arrow is on the tibial tuberosity. This is to the medial side of that. Sartorius is the one that flexes the hip and flexes the knee and laterally rotates the hip, all as the same movement. It's called the Taylor's muscle because sitting on the ground used to be called the Taylor's position. Your kids probably now call it crisscross applesauce or something like that. It's where you sit on the floor cross-legged, or if you're going to do an exercise like butterflies or sit and meditate, that is the position that you need Sartorius to get you into. It's a solid flowing movement. Flex the hip, laterally rotate it, and flex the knee, all in the same movement. And it's all about the femoral nerve. Then we have the quadriceps. The quadriceps are 4 separate muscles that all come together. They include rectus femoris, and then the vastus group, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis. Vastus intermedius would be deep underneath rectus femoris. So you cannot see it in this photo because I can show one or the other, but not both. In the lab, there's one model that has the rectus femoris removed so that you can see it. Let's start with rectus femoris. It comes from the anterior inferior iliac spine, so it also crosses the hip. And we say it goes into the patellar tendon, which is this big white tendon down here, and then through the patella to attach finally to the tibial tuberosity. Now, if I was asking you to match the insertion like I did on the last test, you would be looking for tibial tuberosity as the endpoint for any of the quadriceps. Because it does cross the hip, it can move the hip, it flexes the hip, and it extends the knee. I think of this muscle as your soccer muscle, because if you're going to go kick the soccer ball, first you use your hamstrings to extend the hip and hyperextend, and then when you bring it forward in that strong flexion of the hip and you extend the knee straight to kick the soccer ball, that's all about rectus femoris. And it is all about the femoral nerve for the innervation. The vastus group we're just going to deal with as a group. They are individual muscles, but they are absolute synergists. We have vastus medialis, intermedius, and lateralis. And again, intermedius would be deep underneath rectus femoris. The origin, we're going to go with the general proximal femur. They wrap around the superior portion of the femur. They hit those intertrochanteric line and crest, a little bit of the linea aspera, but just proximal femur. And again, the insertion is on that tibial tuberosity. They come down here with rectus femoris, which is why they're the quadriceps. They all feed into the same tendon. But because they do not cross the hip, they cannot move the hip. They can only work on extension of the knee because they don't actually go to the hip. So they are part of the power of the extension of the knee, but they still receive the femoral nerve because they are anterior.